The man at my aunt's door smelled faintly of rain and old cigarettes. His voice was gentle when he said the words that would unravel everything I thought I knew. Your father owes me his happiness. I remember standing behind my aunt's armchair, a folded towel still in my hand, the sound of the television muttering in the background. The clock above the kitchen door ticked loudly into the silence he left behind. For years, I believed our family was ordinary, dull, even. My mother taught in a small-town school, my father ran a printing shop on the side of the highway, and I grew up in a house where dust gathered faster than secrets. Or so I thought that night, though, when the stranger appeared just before sundown, everything shifted. His coat was soaked from the November drizzle, sleeves dark and heavy, like he'd been walking for hours with only a destination in his head. My aunt, always firm but polite, stood in the doorway holding her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Can I help you? She asked. Her voice trembled slightly, which was unlike her. He looked past her, at me, I think. His eyes seemed to carry a story of their own, something too old to still burn but too deep to fade. Your father, he said quietly. Tell him that Raymond Pierce hasn't forgotten. My father's name wasn't mentioned often here. Aunt Lydia said his name as if it hurt to shape the syllables. He had died when I was 21, a heart attack, sudden, while driving home from work. That was 7 years ago. Before I could step forward, the stranger nodded once, turned back toward the rain, and disappeared down the narrow lane that curved away toward the hills. Do you know that man? I asked. Aunt Lydia shut the door slowly, pressed her hand against it, and whispered in a voice I'd never heard from her, it was bound to happen someday. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The towel I had been folding still lay forgotten on the armchair. I could still picture his wet footprints fading into the rug. My aunt's house was small, 2 bedrooms, warm light from an old brass lamp, shelves filled with photographs of people who had grown older without realizing it. I had moved in 3 months ago, after my breakup with Daniel and the quiet collapse of a life I assumed would go a certain way. Aunt Lydia had welcomed me with tea, new bedsheets, and those small, knowing smiles that said, I won't ask, but I understand. Mornings followed a rhythm here. The kettle whistled, radio murmured old gospel songs, and Lydia called every loaf of bread tired if it was more than a day old. I began working remotely, editing articles for a lifestyle magazine that no one in our neighborhood would ever read. In the evenings, I'd sit at the dining table, watching the way Aunt Lydia rubbed her rosary when she thought no one was looking. She'd never been particularly religious, so I used to joke she was praying for her arthritis. She would laugh, but now, thinking back, there was weariness in it, a kind of guilt disguised as humor. For days after the stranger's visit, she avoided talking about it. Each time I tried to ask, she'd deflect the conversation with stories about my mother's school days or the time my father painted the porch yellow and called it sunshine. But his name, Raymond Pierce, clung to me. I found myself repeating it softly while doing dishes, testing it in my mouth like an unfamiliar word. That Friday, over dinner, I broke the silence. Aunt Lydia, I said, setting down my fork, who was that man? She didn't pretend to misunderstand. I told you, child, some doors are closed for a reason. And some should be opened before they rot, I said quietly. Her eyes lifted to mine. For a moment, I saw something raw flicker there, fear, maybe, or pain that had rusted over the years. You have your father's stubbornness, she said. You should be careful where it leads you. She stood, gathered our plates, and turned away, but I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the dish. That night, as thunder rolled across the valley, I found myself digging through the old chest at the foot of my bed. Half of it was filled with my childhood things, spelling trophies, postcards, faded Polaroids, but tucked beneath them was a bundle wrapped in a yellowed towel. Inside were letters tied with string, each envelope bearing my father's handwriting, the careful, square penmanship I hadn't seen in years. The first one was dated October 1989. The year before I was born. Lydia, I need your help again. I made a mistake, and I don't know how to fix it. If she finds out, everything will fall apart. Please, keep this secret. For her. For me. There was no signature beyond T. But the handwriting, it was his. I read it 3 times, pulse racing, before I took it downstairs to Aunt Lydia, who was knitting by the window. Did you keep these? I asked, laying the letter on the table. Her hands froze mid-motion. She didn't look at the paper. Instead, she looked at the rain outside. He was desperate, she murmured. And I thought I was protecting you. Protecting me from what? She didn't answer. The next morning, I called my mother. She hesitated when I mentioned Raymond Pierce. Where did you hear that name? She asked after a pause too long to ignore. The man came here. He said Dad owes him his happiness. The silence that followed cut through the line so cleanly I could almost hear her breathing. I'll come tomorrow, she said at last. Don't tell anyone else about this. Please. It was the way she said please, softly, urgently, that frightened me. I'd never heard my mother sound afraid of the past. Her train arrived the next evening. She came up the path in her dark green coat, holding her purse like a shield. When she stepped inside, she didn't speak. She only looked around, as if the walls might whisper what she needed to know. Aunt Lydia sat waiting at the table, her rosary on the cloth between them. So it started, Lydia said quietly. Mother didn't deny it. He came. I stood by the counter, feeling suddenly like a child intruding on grown-up sorrow. Who was he, Mama? I asked. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Finally, she said, someone your father couldn't forgive. And someone I couldn't forget. Her voice broke on the last word. I didn't understand then what she meant, not fully. But that night, I overheard their conversation through the thin wall between our rooms. I heard my aunt whisper, she deserves to know. To which my mother replied, if she knows, she'll never see him the same way again. I pressed my hand over my heart, a chill crawling beneath my skin. The next morning, the house felt heavier. The light that usually spilled in through the kitchen window was muted, as if even the sun hesitated to witness what was unfolding inside. I sat at the table watching my mother and Aunt Lydia carefully unwrap years of silence and sorrow between sips of lukewarm tea. Tell me everything, I said quietly, my voice trembling despite myself. My mother sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of a cracked teacup. Your father, he wasn't the man you thought he was. Or maybe he was, just buried beneath mistakes we all want to forget. She told me about Raymond Pierce, a man my father had met before I was born, during a time steeped in secrets. Pierce was the keeper of a truth none of us were ready to face, an adoption, a hidden child, and the affair that my mother had buried deep inside her heart. The girl was born in the city, different from this place, from us, she said, voice thick with years of restrained emotion. We said it never happened. We lied to keep the family together. I felt the room grow colder, the air thick with unsaid words and fragile memories. And the man who came to Aunt Lydia's door? I asked. He was a friend, my mother replied slowly. A man who holds your father accountable for a promise he couldn't keep. He said your father owes him his happiness. I clenched my hands, trying to understand how happiness could be owed, like a debt written in invisible ink on a ledger no one wanted to see. A tea night, I couldn't stop thinking about the promise my father had broken. I remembered the way he smelled, sweat and motor oil from the shop, mixed with something softer like old tobacco. How many years had he carried this weight, hidden behind quiet smiles and evening meals? In the days that followed, I watched my aunt and mother navigate a delicate dance between confession and denial, love and regret. Every conversation I overheard was a thread unraveling, revealing just enough for me to chase but never fully catch. One evening, Aunt Lydia pulled me aside. If you want to know the whole story, she said softly, you need to meet someone. I followed her through the damp streets to a small cafe where an old man waited. His face was lined with years and stories, eyes sharp despite the heaviness in his hands. Raymond Pierce, she whispered. He didn't shake my hand. Instead, he looked straight into my eyes and said, your father promised me his happiness. But promises weren't enough to fix what was broken. The weight of his words settled over me, colder than the November air outside. In that moment, I realized history wasn't just something we remembered. Sometimes it was a shadow lurking behind every smile, every lie, every secret. I went home that night haunted by questions. How had I never known this story? Why had my family chosen silence instead of truth? The walls of the house felt closer, as if the unspoken weight of generations pressed against them. That weekend, I confronted my mother. Why didn't you tell me? I asked after dinner. She looked away, her fingers trembling over the napkin. Because knowing sometimes hurts more than not knowing. But don't I have the right to know who I really am? Tears welled in her eyes. You do, child. More than anyone else. The room was quiet except for the hum of the heater and the distant sound of a clock marking time we couldn't take back. Days later, I found myself sitting alone in the park where I used to play as a child. The wind carried the smell of wet leaves and forgotten promises. I pulled out the first letter I had found, tracing the familiar handwriting. The words seemed both distant and immediate. I made a mistake, and I don't know how to fix it. I wondered then what kind of mistakes a person could live with for a lifetime, burdens heavier than regret, heavier than forgiveness. As I stared at the sky turning grey with the coming dusk, I knew one thing clearly: my family was no longer just mine to protect. It was a story I had to uncover, whatever it took. The letters kept coming, folded and yellowing like fragile promises. I spent hours poring over each one, running my fingers along the faded ink, trying to hear my father's voice between the lines. I never wanted to hurt anyone, one letter began. But sometimes love is greedy, demanding what it can't have and demanding silence. It was the first time I saw that my father was more than the quiet man who brewed morning coffee and wiped down counters. He was a man tangled in choices that had shaped us all without our knowing. My mother had avoided using names, but I found one: Emily. The letters spoke of her in secret, a woman picked from another life, another world away from the dusty roads of our town. One night, beneath the dim glow of my bedside lamp, I finally dared to ask Aunt Lydia the questions I had been hiding even from myself. "Who is Emily?" I whispered. She hesitated, biting her lip. The room smelled like mothballs and peppermint, the same scent Aunt Lydia wore in summer. "She is the daughter your father never spoke of," she said softly. "The child he loved in silence but couldn't claim." My breath caught. "Why didn't he tell you?" "Because truth can tear a family apart," she answered. "And some lies we forgive more easily than the chaos of real life." The days grew colder. And as winter crept closer, so did the realization that our family was on the brink of fracture. And my mother stopped returning my calls after that night. The distance between us felt like a wall built from all the things left unsaid, but the stranger, Raymond Pierce, kept turning in my thoughts. What did he want from us now, after all these years? Late one evening, I found an old photo tucked among the letters, a woman holding a small girl, both smiling under a sunlit sky. The woman was Emily. The girl was the spitting image of my Aunt Lydia. A knot twisted deep inside. I needed answers. I needed to understand what debts my father had left unpaid. The next morning, I drove to the city where Emily lived. The drive was long, weaving through patches of fog and the skeletal branches of winter trees. When I reached her small apartment, my hands shook as I knocked. The door opened slowly. A woman with tired eyes and a cautious smile stood before me. "Are you?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I think we're connected by more than just blood." She stepped aside without hesitation, her voice a fragile bridge between strangers and family. "Come in." Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of lavender and old books. We sat across from each other, the weight of the past between us. "I don't know why he never told you," Emily said after a long silence. "Maybe he thought it would hurt us all more to know. But it didn't. It just left a space where trust should have been." We talked for hours about mothers who lied to protect, fathers who battled ghosts of decisions past, and children who grew up trying to fill the pieces left behind. Emily's story was one of quiet resilience. She'd been raised by a kind woman who wasn't her mother, smiling through a childhood marked by questions without answers. "I wanted him to be proud of me," she said quietly. "But I wasn't sure he ever knew my name." I reached out, taking her hand, realizing that despite the silence, we had both been waiting for this moment. Maybe happiness isn't something owed, maybe we get to choose it, after all. Returning home, the air felt lighter, although the storm had yet to fully pass. I knew our family's story was far from over. There were still conversations to have, wounds to heal, but for the first time in years, I felt a strange kind of hope. A hope built not on secrets but on the messy, imperfect truth of love. As I unlocked the front door, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Aunt Lydia. "We start tomorrow. Together." I closed my eyes and breathed in the crisp winter air. The past was heavy, but it didn't have to define us forever. The following morning, the house felt alive with a quiet urgency. Aunt Lydia, my mother, Emily, and I gathered around the worn kitchen table like a fragile council, each of us holding years of silence between our fingers. For once, the air wasn't heavy with what was hidden, it was thick with the anticipation of what needed to be said. Emily would stay with us for a while, a bridge across the years and secrets, while my mother prepared what she referred to as the reckoning. She didn't speak much about it, but even her usual warmth took on a sharper edge, a resolve that had been tempered long ago by heartbreak. The first step was confronting the past where it all began, my father, or rather, what remained of the memory of him. We visited the small cemetery nestled among barren oak trees. Amid yawning shadows, I traced the edges of my father's tombstone, cold and weathered. Standing beside me, Emily lowered a single bouquet of wildflowers. My mother always said some debts live longer than life, she whispered. Aunt Lydia whispered a prayer, while my mother remained silent, eyes wet with a storm of old grief. It's time we stop running, I said softly, shivering in the cold air. That evening, we huddled back at the house. The room was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock. It was then that my mother finally spoke the words that had been tucked away for decades. Your father had an affair, she said. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal, not just to me, but to everyone who trusted him. The story unfolded slowly, like a dark, twisting river. Before I was born, my father had met Emily's mother, a woman who was not my mother, but someone he cared for deeply. Their connection was intense, secret, and destructive. When Emily was born, my mother made the impossible choice to accept a child who wasn't hers legally but was part of the tangled web. She raised me as she could, burying that secret beneath layers of daily life and silent agreements. Your father promised to make it right, my mother continued, voice faltering. He promised Raymond at the time he'd give Emily a place in our lives. But promises, like debts, can be forgotten. I felt waves of anger first, hot and crashing, stinging the edges of my heart. How could my father hold two worlds in his hands and let one crumble? How could my mother live the lie so deeply, so long? But then came a quieter sorrow, the painful realization that happiness had been poured over by everyone involved, yet never fully grasped. Emily's eyes met mine across the table. We were all victims, she said softly. Not of choice, but of circumstance. She was right. We were threads pulled tight by old debts none of us had asked for but all of us carried. Over the next few days, we began piecing together what it meant to create a new kind of family, one that didn't erase the past but learned to hold its fractures with care. The letters, the photographs, every whispered caution from Aunt Lydia began to feel less like chains and more like maps. I returned to my room one night and stood at the mirror. I looked not just at myself but at a mirror fractured with reflections of everyone I had been told to forget or forgive. The truth was messy and painful, but it was also real, and maybe real was enough. Your father had an affair, she said. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal, not just to me, but to everyone who trusted him. The story unfolded slowly, like a dark, twisting river. Before I was born, my father had met Emily's mother, a woman who was not my mother, but someone he cared for deeply. Their connection was intense, secret, and destructive. When Emily was born, my mother made the impossible choice to accept a child who wasn't hers legally but was part of the tangled web. She raised me as she could, burying that secret beneath layers of daily life and silent agreements. Your father promised to make it right, my mother continued, voice faltering. He promised Raymond at the time he'd give Emily a place in our lives. But promises, like debts, can be forgotten. I felt waves of anger first, hot and crashing, stinging the edges of my heart. How could my father hold two worlds in his hands and let one crumble? How could my mother live the lie so deeply, so long? But then came a quieter sorrow, the painful realization that happiness had been poured over by everyone involved, yet never fully grasped. Emily's eyes met mine across the table. We were all victims, she said softly. Not of choice, but of circumstance. She was right. We were threads pulled tight by old debts none of us had asked for but all of us carried. Over the next few days, we began piecing together what it meant to create a new kind of family, one that didn't erase the past but learned to hold its fractures with care. The letters, the photographs, every whispered caution from Aunt Lydia began to feel less like chains and more like maps. I returned to my room one night and stood at the mirror. I looked not just at myself but at a mirror fractured with reflections of everyone I had been told to forget or forgive. The truth was messy and painful, but it was also real, and maybe real was enough. The morning sun filtered weakly through the curtains, casting pale light across the kitchen table where the remnants of last night's conversation still lingered in the air. Emily had offered to help me sort through the remaining letters, and as we flipped through them, the layers of my father's life peeled away slowly, revealing a man torn between love and duty, between truth and the safety of silence. Sometimes, Emily said quietly, people hold on to secrets because they're scared of what will happen if they don't. But fear can be the heaviest chain. I nodded, the edges of those words settling deep into my chest. It made me think about the years my mother had carried everything herself, the weight of the secret, the betrayals, the cover-up of an affair that shaped nearly our whole family story. Later that afternoon, I met Aunt Lydia by the small garden behind the house. The cool breeze tugged at the faded blooms, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and last year's leaves. She handed me a photograph of my father and Raymond Pierce, taken decades ago, their faces young but serious. They were friends once, she said, her voice low. But friendship isn't always enough when debts pile up. I held the photo tightly, feeling the distance of a lifetime in their eyes. Do you think this debt can ever be paid? I asked. She looked up, eyes sharp despite the softness in her expression. Some debts never leave us, she said. But paying them isn't about transactions. It's about forgiveness, and that's a gift you give yourself. That evening, I sat across from my mother, the room humming quietly around us. I want to understand everything, I said, my voice steady even as my heart trembled. She sighed, and for the first time, the walls between us crumbled just a little. She told me how she had found out about the affair just after I was born, how the pain nearly broke her, and how the choice to hide the truth was made out of desperation, out of a desire to keep our family whole against all odds. I loved your father, she confessed softly. But love isn't always enough to fix what's broken. Do you regret the lies? I asked, her eyes filled with tears. Regret is a luxury when you're trying to survive. I did what I thought was best. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the house began to shift, not disappear, but transform. Emily and I spoke candidly about what it meant to be a family formed of broken promises and second chances. We shared meals and stories, the kind that stitched new threads into worn fabric. One afternoon, I found a letter addressed to me, the last one my father had ever written. He spoke of hope, of forgiveness, and a plea that his silence not be the end. Reading it, I realized the truth was not an enemy, but a bridge waiting to be crossed. The night the truth became public was quieter than I imagined. Whispers traveled through the small town like wind through dry grass. Friends and neighbors looked at us differently, not with judgment, but with the kind of respectful curiosity that comes from knowing no family is without its shadows. Raymond Pierce faced the community with steady eyes, no anger, no demands, just a quiet resolve to claim the happiness he said was owed. It was raw, but dignified inside. The house, forgiveness began to take root, not like a sudden flood but like gentle rain soaking into thirsty soil. My mother, Aunt Lydia, Emily, and I gathered for a small dinner. We didn't speak much about the past, but the warmth in the room said more than words ever could. That night, I understood that healing isn't about erasing pain but about choosing peace despite it. As I write this, I think about the strange debts we all carry, debts of love, of mistakes, of promises we break and make. If my father's story teaches me anything, it's that happiness is not something owed or stolen, it's something we learn to give ourselves, even when the past weighs heavy on our hearts. Would you have faced the truths I uncovered? Or would you have chosen the safety of silence? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us what it means to be human. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other. The truth was no longer ours to keep. It had spilled from the fragile sanctuary of our home into the whispered conversations of neighbors, the lingering glances at church gatherings, and the quiet speculation threading through town markets. By morning, the story of my father's debts, the hidden daughter, and the betrayal that had long shadowed our lives was known. And with that knowledge came consequences, both seen and unseen. On the day the news spread, Aunt Lydia stood by the front window, her gaze fixed on a distant point beyond the tumbling autumn leaves. This is the way of things, she said softly when I joined her. Truth is like water, it finds every crack. What followed wasn't the vengeance one might expect from a family wronged, but a reckoning grounded in unexpected grace. Raymond Pierce, the man who had shown up at our door months ago, bore the weight of his own sorrows with quiet dignity. He did not seek to destroy us but to reclaim a piece of the happiness he believed was stolen, not from theft, but from neglect. When the town council heard his story, many eyes softened. People who had once glanced sideways at my mother's quiet composure now nodded with understanding. At the community meeting, Raymond spoke with a voice both steady and worn. I don't want ruin, he said. I want honesty. For her, for them, and for me. Though some questioned the timing, his openness resonated with many. It was not blame he sought, but recognition and the chance for healing. With the truth laid bare, my family faced the tender balance between justice and compassion. My mother, once silenced by fear, now stood with more firmness than I'd ever seen in her. I may not have been perfect, she admitted when confronted, but I did what I believed was right to protect those I love. The town's verdict was neither harsh nor merciless. Instead, it was a reminder that families, flawed, fractured, yet fiercely resilient, deserve the chance to mend. The ripple effects touched the workplace, too. Our family-owned shop, once the center of my father's world, saw new faces linger with curiosity and old friends offer gentle support. Employees who had heard half-truths now approached with kind eyes, eager to understand the full story of a man whose debts were more emotional than financial. Through it all, the shop remained a symbol not of failure but of endurance. As days unfolded, the community's openness brought new conversations, the kind that heal wounds left by hidden truths and long-buried promises. Aunt Lydia began organizing gatherings, small and intimate, where stories of forgiveness were shared. My mother joined, her posture finally unburdened by the weight of untold secrets. Emily found tentative friendships, her presence no longer a source of whispered judgment but of tentative acceptance. In those moments, the small town where our story had seemed destined to fracture showed instead the power of connection. Most important, within our family, new bonds were forming. Late one night, Emily and I sat by the fire, sharing memories and dreams, weaving a tapestry of belonging that no secret could unravel. "It's strange," she said, "how pain can divide us, but truth can also bring us back together." I smiled, thinking how far we had all come, from strangers shaped by lies to a family learning to stand whole, despite our scars. Healing did not come wrapped in a neat bow. It arrived slowly, like dawn breaking over hills worn by time. In the quiet moments after the storm had passed, my family began to piece together a new normal, one built not on illusions, but on acceptance and courage. My mother started attending counseling, learning to untangle the guilt she had carried for so many years. Her voice returned, stronger and steadier, each day more sure that the past no longer had to define her worth. The printing shop reopened with fresh energy, a living tribute to my father's legacy and the resilience he could not witness. Emily became part of our household, not as an outsider or a secret, but as a sister reclaiming her rightful place. We shared chores, laughter, and the quiet rhythms of family life, a life marked by imperfection but rich in honesty. Sometimes, late at night, we would sit in the soft glow of the kitchen, the aroma of burnt toast mingling with whispered stories of what had been, and what might be. There was a strength in those small rituals, a healing power in the act of existing together without pretense. I learned through all this that forgiveness is not a single act but a path walked daily. It requires patience, empathy, and above all, a willingness to see others not as villains, but as human beings shaped by their own struggles. My father's debts were not erased, they remained etched into the contours of our family's story, but they no longer held us captive. We had found a way to carry them lightly, as a reminder of love's complexity and the courage it takes to keep loving in spite of it all. One afternoon, as the sun warmed the kitchen windows, Aunt Lydia handed me a small box wrapped in faded paper. Inside was a framed photo of my father, smiling with an ease I had never seen before. Beneath it was a note: "For happiness, you must choose it even when it is hardest to find." Her gentle words echoed deep inside me. They were a gift, and a challenge. To choose hope. To choose peace. To choose family even when the road was steep and uncertain. The last weeks had brought a strange kind of peace to our home, a fragile truce with the past and a tentative hope for a future woven from truth instead of lies. One late autumn evening, I found myself sitting on the old porch with Aunt Lydia, wrapped in a shawl against the crisp air. We watched the stars blink awake one by one, the world hushed and waiting. "You've grown strong," she said quietly. Her voice carrying the weight of wisdom earned through sorrow. I smiled faintly, the night breeze tugging at the edges of my shawl. "Stronger than I thought I could be," I admitted. In that moment, I understood that life was not about erasing the mistakes or debts that shaped us. It was about learning how to carry them with grace and use them to become better, not perfect, but whole. The day came when Emily left to begin a new chapter in her own life. The goodbye was quiet, full of hugs that promised this was just the beginning, not an end. Standing by the door, I thought about how strange and beautiful it was that family wasn't just about shared blood, but about the courage to face the truth together. As the seasons changed, the echoes of the past began to soften under the steady light of forgiveness. Our house, once a place of silent shadows, now held laughter and stories, imperfect but honest. I learned that sometimes, happiness isn't found in the absence of pain, but in the ability to embrace life's complexities, the messy, tangled love that makes us human. My father's debts were never just his alone, they were ours. And in facing them, we found freedom. I wonder, as I share this story with you now, what secrets are we holding on to that ask to be released? What debts do we carry in silence, afraid to confront? In the end, the stranger at my aunt's door opened more than just a conversation. He opened a path toward understanding and healing. We are all shaped by the truths we face and the lies we overcome. What would you have done if you were in my place? Have you ever had to confront a hidden past in your own family? Tell me your story in the comments below. Your voice matters. If this story touched something in your heart, please subscribe and support the channel. We are here to remind each other that no one walks these journeys alone. Thank you for listening, and take care of yourselves and each other.